Well, again, this morning I welcome you to the purple space where we seek to find common ground with others who may think and live differently than we do and hold different ideals. This morning I want to start out talking about Hurricane Helene, and then we're going to change gears a little bit. Right now, Hurricane Helene is the second deadliest hurricane in history. At the time that I wrote this message, there were more than 190 people who had died and many who were still missing. There were more than 1 million customers who were without power. Whole towns had been washed into lakes, and feet of mud were in the structures that had survived. Whole power grids were out, and some areas were only getting supplies through the use of mules or by air delivery. There had been 3,500 FEMA personnel deployed. Now, in your bulletin today, you should have had an insert, and I'd like you to pull it out and turn to the side that has pictures on it. These are some of the images from Hurricane Helene. I cannot even imagine living through this. There's only one hurricane that is listed as more devastating in history, and that was Katrina in 2005. Do you remember that at all? Yeah, and the death toll with Katrina was 1,392. And the damages attributed to that hurricane came in at $125 billion. Now, the middle picture that you see here is actually of a recovery crew that went into a church, and it is from Hurricane Helene. But the quote underneath it, I've modified a little bit, because the original quote said, Hurricane Katrina was an act of nature. What we do here is an act of God. So I've modified it to say, this hurricane was an act of nature. What we do here is an act of God. I'd like you to keep that in mind. You might want to keep those pictures in front of you as I share this message, because today we're going to talk about compassion. Having compassion. And you know, when there's this overwhelming devastation, like this hurricane, it touches the compassion note in all of us, and we want to know what we can do to help. There are so many who are devastated. And it's hard to be told, you need to wait until emergency services tell us that it's safe enough for rescue and repair efforts. Because if too many people arrive and there's no power and there's no sanitary means and the feet of mud are still up to here, we just add to the problem. Compassion is not hard to have when you're talking about the effects of a hurricane. But today we're going to talk about compassion in a different sense. We're going to talk about having compassion about people who are different from us. Different experiences, different culture, different worldview, maybe different language, different opinions. Compassion grows when we are able to know ourselves and one another at a deeper level, and then use that knowledge so that we can respond out of understanding. So let me ask you this. Did you ever know anyone who lived through the Great Depression? Do you know anyone who lived through the Great Depression? My great-grandparents and my grandparents lived through the Great Depression. My great-grandparents were a young married couple during that time, and I can tell you that that affected their worldview all the way through their lives. So what did you notice about someone who lived through the Great Depression? How did that affect their lives? Say it out loud and proud. Saved everything. Waste not, want not. Fix everything. Don't waste food. For my great-grandparents, it meant share with your neighbors what you've got. Yeah, and be conservative. Now, my great-grandparents lived on a farm. Do you know that farmers were actually in this area, not out in the Dust Bowl, but in this area, farmers were actually better off than the town folk. And I can remember my great-grandpa saying that he would take truckloads of produce into town and give it away. You know, when you live through something so overwhelming, and I imagine the worldviews of those who have lived through Hurricane Helene have forever changed. When you live through something that overwhelming, you cannot help but have a different understanding of things. And compassion goes to a different level. You know, compassion bridges us to other people. When we have compassion for another person, what does that mean? What does it mean? So compassion is when we strive to see through their perspective. What's the phrase that we use? Walk in someone else's shoes for a while, and we'll have compassion for them. See with their eyes, hear with their ears, understand from their perspective. Try to get to know them well enough that we have some understanding of their perspective. So Jessica read that second passage for us today out of the prophet Isaiah. That passage is known by a particular moniker. Do you have any recall about what that might be? I mean, the images are kind of unlikely pairings, right? It's the wolf shall live with the lamb. The leopard lie down with the kid. None of that makes sense, you know? It's called the peaceable kingdom. That passage of Isaiah is called the peaceable kingdom. And it's an image of unlikely things sharing time, food, and space with one another. How many of you have been to the Cincinnati Zoo? Yeah, I've been there a number of times, but my most memorable time was when I officiated a wedding at the giraffe paddock of the Cincinnati Zoo. And let me tell you, that was an experience. Because the daddy giraffe tried to eat the bride's veil. He was not used to sharing his space with a wedding party. And the bride had to grab her veil, and there was a tug of war. Guess who won? The giraffe. That's right, her veil went into the abyss. Think of prowling leopards and frolicking baby goats sharing the same enclosure. How do you think that would go? Think of lambs sharing space with wild predators. So, think of a toddler being turned loose in a den of snakes. This is the passage out of Isaiah. That's what he's describing. Unlikely alliances. That's what Isaiah is describing. And Jesus, now we're going to switch gears here a minute. Jesus had his own unlikely alliances even within his group of disciples. So what do you remember about his disciples? Who did he call? They weren't the bigwigs, were they? Yeah, they were the common men, common folk, except we don't often realize this. Jesus called a zealot. Now, zealots were their own force of the population, and they were very anti-Rome. If you were a member of the zealot folk, you didn't like anything about Rome. And he called a tax collector. Who did the tax collectors work for? 12 disciples. He had these two bozos in the same group. Really? What was he thinking? It would be like inviting a die-hard Trump supporter wearing his t-shirt, "Make America Great Again," and a fervent Harris supporter waving, "We're not going back again," flag to serve in his inner circle. How do you think that would go? A lot of very calm conversation, I'm sure. How do we have compassion for someone who is so opposite from where we stand? Jesus promoted the golden rule. But what does it mean to love your neighbor when you're at opposite ends of the pole? First, I believe that we have to realize that all people are neighbors at a certain level. We share the same earth, we breathe the same air, we've all been created by the same God in God's image. Second, showing compassion and love for others may not involve warm, fuzzy feelings. It's a conscious decision. Love is a conscious decision, an act of will to work for the common good, a desire to bring blessing to someone else, even though we see things differently than they do. We're not going to work to drag them down. We're going to work to build us up. You know, when the lives of millions of people are devastated by a hurricane, we don't stop to survey their ethnic background or their political views or their bank account. before we offer help. We help, period. We offer and respond with compassion. What if we made the decision to withhold our judgment about someone else until we made the opportunity to get to know them a little better? Find out what makes them tick. Perhaps we could share a cup of coffee and conversation. Maybe we could partner together for a common concern. When we start sharing things with one another, even small things like conversation over coffee, we make room for compassion to build. Think about this a minute. Now I want you to engage your brain and think about what I'm going to say. When politics are working well, they are not set in stone positions. I want to repeat that because then I'm going to build on it. When politics are working well, there's not set in stone positions. If you're a Democrat, you have to do this. If you're a Republican, you have to do that. When politics are working well, elected officials can make temporary alliances for common concerns that address the greater good. They can step across the aisle and work together. You know, until the Lord returns, I loved Bessie's observation today. Jesus is coming back, and a child shall lead us. Until the Lord returns, our world is always going to be broken. In the meantime, what do? Do we sit around and wait for the second coming? No, we have work to do, friends. We may not be able to win the decisive battle over evil. Jesus took care of that. But we can at least influence the conflict that we're in right now.